So, from a fundamental level, Sagrada and Roll Player are very similar games in what they attempt to do. Each are dice manipulation games that involve players having their own personalized player boards that they are interacting with. Collectively, you're rolling dice and plugging them into that board to try and get certain numbers and certain colors and certain locations, and that will allow you to ultimately score points based on the patterns that you create. From this perspective, these games are very similar. They've got a lot of comparisons that can easily be made, but I think the big factor that differentiates them, the thing that sort of makes them unique experiences, is what they're trying to capture. Looking at both games from a strictly price and contents perspective, Roll Player looks to create an experience that is much larger, much grander in scope. It's got a lot more stuff in the box and a lot more complexity overall in terms of what that stuff presents. Roll Player is $60. It's got 6 double-sided player boards, 73 dice of 7 color types, 101 cards, various tokens, a dice bag, and a rule book that is 16 pages long. This is compared to Sagrada, runs $40. It has 4 generic player boards with 12 double-sided window patterns on it. There are 90 dice with 5 different colors represented, 27 cards, 24 favor tokens, a round tracker, a dice bag, and a rule book that is only 4 pages long. Looking at the player boards briefly, Roll Player clearly has a very strong aesthetic to it. There's a lot of talent that went into the art that represents the different races, such as the humans, the orcs, so on and so forth. And the boards are double-sided and presents a picture for both the male and female counterpart for each race, which is a very nice touch and positive addition, I think, to the game and the game feel, allowing you to customize how your character is, even in such a slight manner. Fundamentally, the boards play more or less the same beyond modifiers for 2 different stats on the boards, which are very minor differences between the player boards. But the various cards that are attached throughout the game, your class, your alignment, your backstory, all of that provides a certain level of variety to the game. In comparison, Sagrada, all the player boards are functionally the same. They're just placeholders for the window patterns. There are 24 patterns. You get to choose between 2 on a double-sided card that you're provided, which not only dictates the pattern that you're playing throughout the game, but also the number of favor tokens that you start the game with, which will get you access to the different abilities. So, because of this, setup for Roll Player is very extensive. You have to choose a player board, get all of these cards plugged in, and then you have to roll a bunch of starting dice and plug those into your boards before you even start the game. Whereas Sagrada, you take a board, you take a card, and you plug that in, and you're basically good to go beyond some slight card setup beforehand. Dice rolling. For Roll Player, the basic game loop is that the first player rolls dice equal to the number of players plus 1, and lines them up in numerical order. Each player chooses to take one of those and plug them into a stat, and when you plug it into a stat, you activate a specific ability associated with that stat. Then players have opportunities to purchase cards, and they do it not in player order, but in initiative order, which is determined by the value of the die that you took. On the flip end of that, Sagrada, the start player rolls dice equal to the number of players times 2 plus 1, and then players draft those dice in clockwise order and then in counterclockwise order. When you draft a die, you plug it into your board adjacent to dice that you had already placed, and it's a much more of a puzzly kind of feel where you're trying to fill in a board in a similar sense as something like Sudoku. where you can't have the same number or color adjacent to each other, and then there are patterns on the window pattern in question that you're going to need to fill out specific numbers and colors onto those spots. During your turn, you can spend favor tokens to activate abilities, but rather than it being a separate phase in and of itself, it's a natural part of each player's turn as it already is understood. So scoring. So Roll Player has 6 different ways to score, each as involved as the last. Attribute goals allow you to get points based on whether or not you hit a specific value. For each of the stats on your board, class color dice give you points for the dice that you put into your board that is the same as your class color. The alignment card is your alignment is shifted around throughout the game based on different skills or different actions that you take that will modify that. Your backstory card gives you points based on if you were able to plug certain colors into certain locations on your board throughout the game. Armor cards are sets of cards that you can collect that will get you a cumulative bonus of points. And trait cards are going to get you additional points based on whether or not you achieved certain goals throughout the game. Sagrada, on the other hand, has 3 scoring cards that are the primary ways of scoring. You score based on a secret color that you have. So if my secret color is blue, I get points based on the values on all of my blue dice. You get 1 point for each additional favor token you have at the end of the game, and you get minus 1 point for each unfilled location on your board at the end of the game. So that's kind of the rundown how each of them works, but I think you can already sort of see what I'm talking about simply from discussing how the games are played out. Role Player, if anyone's familiar with role-playing games and they sit down to play this, they're immediately going to get this rush of nostalgia. They're going to get this feeling of, remembering all of the games that they've enjoyed in the past, all of the adventures, and the attachment that players have had to their characters in the past. And being able to sort of get that vibe without having to commit to a full game of D&D, I think is valuable to a lot of players in that regard. It's exciting to get to build a new character. It's investing to sort of attach yourself to the idea of, here's my backstory, here's my alignment, here's how I want to sort of play out the game. And so from an aesthetics perspective, the art is gorgeous and really adds to that, and the overall feel of how the game reminds you or allows you to reminisce on those experiences, I think, are huge. It values nostalgia in a big way, and it gives that great feeling overall. Mechanically, though, this game is a little rough. Setup and takedown is very involved because of how many moving components there are for every player, in terms of all the cards you have to set up, in terms of all the dice that you have to preset on everyone's boards, and then you have to set up the market, and so on and so forth. It gets a little overwhelming, especially after your first couple of games and sort of the initial inertia of playing a new game wears off. Cards aren't necessarily balanced. There are some cards that will provide you points for doing poorly in certain stats, which sort of help to mitigate some of the bad luck you might have when taking certain dice. But there are other cards that provide you with goals that are simply absurd or just cannot get you enough points to be worth purchasing that card. On that note, some abilities on your player boards are far better than others. For instance, Strength versus Intelligence. Strength is an ability that allows you to take a die and flip it to its opposite side and keep that value. Whereas Intelligence is you get to choose a die on your board and re-roll it, and then either keep the previous value or the new value. Strength has a predetermined value that you will get when you do it, and no matter how many times you take that action, you know exactly what you're getting whenever you take it. Intelligence is a crapshoot. You're literally trying to roll a better value for you, and whether or not it is or isn't is completely up to chance. And oftentimes, I found that when I try to do the action, I end up rolling the exact same value, which kind of screws you in that regard, or you roll a worse value than you wanted and the action becomes moot, it becomes pointless. So funnily enough, it's more intelligent to take the strength action than the intelligence action in this game. And the scoring is very convoluted for what it does. There's a lot of moving parts, as you may have gathered. There's like 5 different types of cards, and 2 of them get you different sets of points. Skill cards allow you to do special things, and it's all very convoluted, and I'm not sure that adds to the game. I'm not sure that helps the game along, because the different cards are so involved, are so differentiated. It makes it so that the game feels heavy when it's just a lot of set dressing to try and sort of mimic role player. Ultimately, the game can be fun, but the mechanics aren't terribly strong. And when compared to Sagrada, it's clear that role player values that game feel, values that experience over tight scoring. Looking at Sagrada, on the other hand, Sagrada's theme is barely there. Like, yeah, you're building windows for churches. You're building these grand, whatever. It's colored dice on a square board with some aesthetics surrounding it. The art is fine. It's not amazing, in my opinion, and it doesn't really add much of anything to the game itself. I don't feel like I'm necessarily doing a specific thing. I feel like I'm trying to complete a puzzle, and that's where the enjoyment of Sagrada comes from for me. That sort of very quick, tight gameplay that goes back and forth. Once players are familiar enough with the game, you can play a game in like 20 minutes, especially if it's a 2-player game. I've played a 15-minute 2-player game. That's just a very rewarding experience, I think, for everyone involved. It's you are filling out your personal board, and either you fill it out and it feels great, or you don't, and you are frustrated and you want to do better. You want to learn how to do better. You want to figure out how to get that pattern right just for you. And the amount of variety in terms of the different patterns that you can play on makes it very replayable. 24 different patterns to play around with. And realistically, you won't remember the patterns game to game. So even if you do replay some of the same patterns, you're not going to have like a specific, strategy to them outside of your overall understanding of the game. And there's this tension turn to turn of, I really need both of these dice, but I'm going to take this one because I need this one just a little bit more, and I have to hope that no one takes the other one before it gets back to me. And each of the different places that you can have in turn order are beneficial in their own ways. So there's that really, each turn feels slightly different in terms of how you're playing it and how you're experiencing it, which is a lot of fun in my eyes. My only real gripe with the game overall is that the secret color scoring feels a little overpowered. Oftentimes, if a player gets all 5s and 6s onto their board of their specific color, they end up doing particularly well and often winning. Whereas the other scoring cards, the patterns and the stuff that you're trying to make on the board, can get you a lot of points, but they're not as guaranteed. On top of this, it's a lot harder to get values of dice to roll in your favor. There's a certain number of colored dice in the bag, and you're always going to see those colored dice if you're playing a 4-player game. You will always see all 18 of each color. But in terms of rolling, if you have unlucky rolls on your color, and none of the abilities on the board allow you to modify that, then that's it. You get what you get. And so from that perspective, the luck of the roll can seriously help you win or lose the game in terms of that aspect. Ultimately, both of these games are going to appeal to 2 very different audiences. There are the audience that will be looking to go on an adventure with your friends regardless of what happens and who wins. And then there's going to be the group of players who are very competitive and want to challenge themselves both in terms of their skill of fulfilling the puzzle and challenging themselves as to beating out the other players in the group. And, Roll Player caters to one audience and Sagrada caters to the other. And I think that's really interesting to look at and to sort of value. For me, I'm always going to value mechanics over game feel. I think that regardless of how it looks, if you're able to play and have those really great interactions with other players and try to outwit everyone else at the table, that's going to be a lot more rewarding for me personally. But I think both of these games can stand out on their own as very strong examples of how similar games can be designed so differently to create such different experiences. Thank you for checking this out. Let me know your thoughts below. Do you prefer Sagrada? Do you prefer Roll Player? And why? Check me out on Facebook and on Board Game Geek. Thank you all so much for checking in, and I will see you next time.